Hello, biblical history students. New Testament time. I'm going to make a short video for you today where I kind of touch upon a few details from chapters 1 and 2 that you've already done, but I wanted to say a few more things about, like I said, a few of the specifics because there's some juicy stuff in those chapters, and then kind of give you a heads up on what's going to be going on with chapters 3 and 4. Okay, so you've all done your homework for New Testament history, chapter the prologue, and then chapters 1 and 2. The prologue, like I said, I think it's self-explanatory. It just talks about the genre of the Gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark technically are labeled ancient biographies, and Luke, Acts, is labeled a historical monograph. Very similar. It's just the only difference is Matthew and Mark clearly just focus on the person of Jesus more than anything, whereas Luke emphasizes not just Jesus, but the growth of the church and events of the early first century church, the first generation church. So that's something. A lot of the stuff in the prologue are, just background stuff on how you read the Gospels. I think those are straightforward. Chapter 1, that was about the background of Alexander the Great and the Hellenism, how it became very influential. Again, Hellenism was the overall culture. Judaism was the religion we're dealing with. And, obviously the difference, and I think I put this in some of the comments on for some people, just like Christianity in America has a distinct American flavor because we're Americans, the culture influences us, so we do church kind of an American way. I can guarantee you, if you travel to Russia or Iraq or Africa, those cultures, Christians in those cultures, even though they're all Christians and they'll hold to the same core tenets of Christianity, like think of the Nicene Creed, the way they do their churches and the way they relate to their culture is going to be very different. It's just going to look different because they're in a different culture. And so Witherington's point when it came talking about religion and culture in the first century is we're dealing with Judaism, but at that time and place, it was highly influenced by Greek culture. It was inevitable. So therefore, and this is one of the things that is important to realize, a lot of times if you grew up going to church, going to Sunday school, you kind of read the New Testament things, and you always kind of unconsciously think, oh, the Jews in Jesus' day were just like the Jews in King David's day, because it's just Jews. Not really. King David was, a good 1,000 years before in a culture that's very steeped in ancient Near East culture. It wasn't Roman culture. It wasn't Greek culture. It very different. And so that's why it's being emphasized. When we're dealing with the first century, the Judaism in the first century, and the Christianity in the first century, it's in a Greco-Roman context. And so you really have to understand that context to better understand what's in the New Testament. Another thing he talks about specifically is Antiochus Epiphanes and basically the Maccabean Revolt. Almost everybody, when you answered that, I kind of basically said that's a fascinating story, and it really is. The whole story of the Maccabean Revolt, and that really does have an impact on how you understand some of the things in the New Testament. I'll give you one or two off the top of my head. In the Maccabean Revolt, after the Jews revolted against Antiochus Epiphanes and pushed him out because he was trying to destroy Judaism, Judas Maccabeus came riding into Jerusalem, riding on a white horse. The people of Jerusalem came out waving palm branches, welcoming him in as the victor. And he went into the temple and he cleansed the temple of the idolatrous pollution that Antiochus Epiphanes had put in there. Now, since he wasn't the Messiah, he basically said, we're just going to hold on to this kingdom until the Messiah comes. That's the Hasmonean dynasty. But that picture of the conquering Jewish conqueror coming into Jerusalem and cleansing the temple after a great military victory has a huge impact on how you understand the triumphal entry in the Gospels. Jesus comes riding in on a donkey. They're waving palm branches. They're singing, and we'll get to this in the next few chapters. They're singing songs about "Blessed is the kingdom of the coming kingdom of David." What does the crowd expect Jesus to do? Well, Judas Maccabeus fought against the foreign oppressor and he cleansed the temple. That's what Jesus is going to do if he's the Messiah, right? Well, then when you read the account, Jesus comes in and flips everything on their heads, as we'll see. But you have to know the Maccabean Revolt story to understand the significance of what happens in the triumphal entry scene later on. So be looking for that. He talks about that stuff. In chapter 2 is where we get some of the specific things in the infancy narratives that I want to elaborate on just a little bit, because we're dealing with the topic of history. The first thing I want to talk about is, obviously, he has a bunch of questions about Herod the Great. As you can tell, Herod the Great was a bad dude. But that's the context. Specifically with the infancy narratives, really I'm looking at numbers 6 and 7-ish. Concerning the date of Jesus' birth, I mentioned this in the last video. Both Matthew and Luke mention it happened in the days of Herod the Great. But then Luke also mentions that Jesus' birth happened during the census of Caesar Augustus, while Quirinius was the governor of Syria, which would be 6 AD CE, whereas the other one would be 4 BC. There's a 10-year difference. So obviously people pull their hair out, like, when was Jesus born? What is Luke just screwing things up? He's not much of a historian if he's off by 10 years. Well, hopefully, and when you read that, what you saw is this is my opinion. Either Luke really is a horrible historian, but no scholar thinks he was a horrible historian. When you look at this seeming discrepancy, you have to ask yourself, why is Luke doing it? I tend to think that Luke is associating the birth of Jesus with the census of Caesar, because one of his major themes in the Gospel of Luke is to say that Jesus is the true Lord and Savior of the world, not Caesar. So he's intentionally making that connection, and he's kind of doing some literary creativity here to draw that connection right at the beginning, that even at the time when Caesar is showing his power over the whole known world by just ordering everybody to have a census, that's the time that God becomes flesh and Jesus is born, and he's the true Lord and Savior. So, long story short, even though Luke says Jesus' birth was during the time of the census, which would have been in 6 AD, in reality, it probably wasn't. Luke is just tying that in to make a Christological connection. It's more likely that Jesus was probably born closer to 4 BC, BCE, which both Luke and Matthew kind of acknowledge as well. So that's one thing. The other thing, based on the other dates that Luke gives, he says that John the Baptist started his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius. That would have placed it either in 27 or 29, probably 27, which would then... His ministry was around 27, it lasted for a couple of years, and then Jesus came shortly after that. 27 to 30 would have been about the time period of Jesus' ministry. The Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, says that Jesus was about 33 or 34, which would be about right if he was born in 4 BC and he was, died in 30. That's around 34. So that's the general time frame. We can't nail it down to a specific date, but we can get really close to say that Jesus was born probably around 4 BC-ish, and that his ministry was 27 to 30-ish, and he was probably, this one is possibly pretty detailed, that he was crucified on Passover in 30 or 33. There's a reason for it, but it's one of those two, but it's probably, most scholars think it's 30. Anyway, so that's the birth dating issue. That's one thing. As far as the next thing I want to say is the question number 9, the question about the virgin birth, or technically the virginal conception. I did my PhD on understanding Isaiah 7:14 in the context of Isaiah. And too often, I'll try to summarize all my findings here in like a few minutes. Too often when people read the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, particularly Matthew, because he has a lot of Old Testament quotations, they think that these Old Testament quotations, these citations, were just kind of like said hundreds of years before, and some prophet back then made a prediction about a specific event that wasn't to happen for 700 years, and now through Jesus it happened. You see, it's right. That's not really a good way to understand what the gospel writers are doing with the idea of fulfilled prophecy. Long story short, basically what they're doing, and we'll tie it into the Matthew-Isaiah thing here. When the New Testament gospel writer quotes an Old Testament passage, what he wants you to do is to look back at the fuller context of that passage, not just that one verse. So, for example, if I said, if we were talking and I just said, "Oh, say, can you see?" I don't have to say the entire Star-Spangled Banner. That little phrase, you know what I'm talking about, and you kind of know the larger context automatically because you're familiar with what it is. So, when Matthew, in this case, quotes Isaiah 7:14, he wants his readers to look back at Isaiah 7 as a whole, and then to interpret what he's saying about Jesus in his gospel against the light of that larger context. It's not just a prediction that finally comes true. It's a pointer to a larger context through which you interpret what he's trying to say about Jesus. Now, obviously, that's a huge thing. Here's the issue. In Isaiah 7:14 in Hebrew, the context of Isaiah 7:14 is something called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. It happened roughly 740-ish BC. Basically, the kingdom of Judah under Ahaz was threatened by the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Syria. These two were ganging up on Judah. And Ahaz is freaking out because he thinks they might attack him and topple him. Isaiah, if you read chapter 7, Isaiah comes to Ahaz and he basically says, God, the God of Israel, is telling you not to be afraid of these two guys. Put your faith in God and he will protect you from these two guys. And Ahaz basically says, I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm going to get Assyria on the line because Assyria was the major superpower, and I'm going to ask Assyria for help, which is kind of like calling up a mob boss for protection. He'll protect you, but then you're under his thumb for the rest of your life. And so because Ahaz says, I'm going to ask Assyria for protection, I'm not going to ask the God of Israel for protection, that's when Isaiah launches into this long prophecy, of which Isaiah 7:14 is part. And basically, he's saying, I'm totally paraphrasing, he's basically telling Ahaz, you idiot, if you're going to ask Assyria for protection, they're going to come in and they're going to make your life a living Hades. Because of your unfaithfulness, you are inviting oppression on your people. But behold, the Alma is with child. That child, by the time that child grows up and knows good from evil, he's going to put his faith in the God of Israel, and God's going to work through him to lift the boot of Assyria off Judah's neck. There was an initial historical context for that. And basically, when you read that in context, it goes like this. The Syro-Ephraimite crisis in 740-ish under Ahaz happened. His unfaithfulness led to Assyrian oppression. His son, the Emmanuel child in the original context, was Hezekiah. By the time Hezekiah grew up to become the king, and we talked about this in the Old Testament book, he rebelled against Assyria. He put his faith in the God of Israel, and the God of Israel freed him from Assyrian oppression. So there's that bookend event, those two events that kind of capture a big chunk of Isaiah. Now, Jews knew that Isaiah 7:14 was a prophecy about the birth of Hezekiah that was fulfilled in the time of Sennacherib's invasion. That was the original context. There's a lot more we could say, but basically in the original context, Isaiah 7:14 is about the birth of Hezekiah. So, Matthew's audience knows that. Matthew quotes that. What he's trying to tell his audience is that Jesus is like Hezekiah, but bigger. In that sense, he's fulfilling the whole story of Israel. And therefore, he can point to events back in Israel's history and say, what Jesus is doing here is like that event, but just on a bigger scale. So Hezekiah put his faith in the God of Israel, and God freed Judah from Assyria. What Matthew is thus going to be saying is Jesus is the true king of all of Israel, the true king of the Jews, the true Lord. He is going to be faithful, and because he's faithful, God's going to free humanity from not just Assyrian oppression, but ultimately satanic oppression, the oppression of death. So it's that kind of thing. Now, specifically about the virgin part, the Hebrew word alma does literally mean just young maiden, young girl. Okay, the Hebrews had another word, betula, which literally was referring to a virgin, and so nobody thought in Isaiah 7 when Isaiah said that first he was referring to a virgin there in Ahaz's court. He's talking about his wife, who got pregnant the old-fashioned way. But the word alma, it could refer to a virgin, but it really just refers to a young lady. Like I said, but betula literally means virgin, and the word used in Isaiah is alma, it's not betula. Now, what Matthew is then doing is he's using that idea, because it can mean virgin, he's kind of making that word do double duty in Matthew. On one hand, he's like Hezekiah, but he is also saying that Mary was a virgin. Now, the question for us is he saying she was a literal virgin? Is it more metaphorical? That's up. Scholars and people debate that all the time. But I will throw this out. Because Matthew and Luke make it a point to contrast Jesus with Caesar, if you were a Roman citizen at the time, Augustus Caesar was known as the one born of a virgin who was the Lord and Savior of the world. Those were his titles. And so when you read in the Gospels that Jesus is born of a virgin and he is the Lord and Savior, at the very least, we should be able to agree that what Matthew and Luke are saying is that it's Jesus, not Caesar, who's the true Lord. He's the one really born of a virgin, not Caesar. Now, obviously, nobody believed that Augustus Caesar was literally born of a virgin. It was a metaphorical way to say he's a deity, that kind of thing. And so that's kind of what Matthew and Luke are saying with that. It's kind of complex, but there's a little more backstory there to understand what's going on. At the very least, I'm saying that Matthew is referring to the Hezekiah, Syro-Ephraimite crisis, Sennacherib invasion. Jesus is like that, but bigger. He's also making a comment that Jesus, not Caesar, is the true Lord. That's it. Okay, as far as the genealogies are concerned, it is also interesting to see that Luke and Matthew's genealogy do not agree, and they both go through Joseph. And so this is another thing that we have to get our minds around, is that, growing up now in the age of Ancestry.com, we automatically, as soon as we see some kind of genealogy, we think biology, literal genealogy. We have to wonder if Matthew and Luke are using those genealogies in the same way. I don't think they are, because when you line them up, it's pretty clear. You have Jesus, Joseph, and then the grandfather is different. And on top of that, Luke's genealogy just goes through a whole bunch of people. It goes through David and Solomon and David, all the way back to Adam. Matthew's genealogy goes through David and Solomon, but Matthew goes through the actual kings of Israel, which aren't in Luke. So, to put it another way, in Israel, Solomon's son was Rehoboam. He was a king of Judah. Rehoboam is mentioned in Matthew. In Luke mentions a different son of Solomon. So it's a totally different genealogy coming from the same thing. Why do they do that? It's pretty, well, it's not simple, but here it is in a nutshell. Luke's audience is a Gentile audience. Therefore, when he takes Jesus' genealogy up, through David, because he's the main guy, Abraham, all the way back to Adam, because ultimately, Jesus is the new humanity, and it encompasses all of humanity. That's the point. That's the theological, Christological point of his genealogy. He's not doing biology, he's doing Christology. Matthew's genealogy goes through the kings of Israel back to Abraham, because Matthew's audience is largely a Jewish audience, so he's emphasizing that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. So he puts it that way, and it goes back to Abraham because Abraham is the father of the Jews. Again, he's doing Christology to address who Jesus is for their particular audience. I think you have to realize that. I think realizing they're using the genealogies for different purposes helps put to bed a lot of controversies concerning like scientific biological genealogies. If they're not doing that, it's not an issue. Okay. And then mentioned about Herod's killing all the male children in Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a very small town. He wasn't sending a huge troop of soldiers. It was probably just a couple assassins to kill a couple babies. Yes, obviously we don't have any other record outside of the Gospels of it. But let's face it, if you're Herod, you're not gonna not gonna announce that to the world. But that assassination mission of the babies is entirely in character with what we know about Herod the Great. So it's entirely possible that he really did that. Okay. So anyway, those are just a couple of the things I wanted to mention with chapters 1 and 2. There's a lot of stuff there. As far in terms of history, the issues are when was Jesus born, and those issues, the Caesar's census issue, and the genealogy issues, what that is. Okay, what you're going to be reading in chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 really takes you up to the time of John the Baptist and Jesus, as you'll see in the chapters, like from the birth of Jesus up to about 27. You're going to learn more about the Herodian family and what they did. Pay attention to the Zealots. The Zealots are a hugely important group in the first century. In fact, it was during Caesar Augustus's census in 6, under that the Zealot party, if you will, under Judas the Galilean, really started, and for the rest of the century, they were fighting against Rome. So the Zealots are a very important group to pay attention to, because that has an impact on how you understand a lot of the Gospels as well, and as well other things as well. He's going to mention Jesus' early years, which basically means we don't know much about Jesus' early years. We just got to deal with it. He's going to talk about John the Baptist and his ministry. That's an important thing to understand what John the Baptist was doing in that context of that time. What the essence of his message is, how Jesus' ministry relates to John the Baptist's ministry. Those are going to be important. So pay attention to the Zealots. Pay attention to what John the Baptist was all about. And then in chapter 4, you're going to learn a little bit more about Pilate. Pilate, you want to know about him. Let's put it this way. He was the Roman governor who just liked to stick it to the Jews anytime he could, just to get them angry. That tells you something about him. He's going to play a prominent role, obviously, in the Gospels. And he's going to talk about the significance of Jesus' baptism and the beginning of his ministry and the significance of what he's doing. All those things are important to note. Okay, and then next week or so, I'll make another video where I touch upon those issues once you've read about them, and then we'll just kind of keep going from there. All right, bye.